Hello, hello, guys. So I am back, and we are still in our 5E of muscles and energy, except we're gonna do our explain. All right. So the previous lesson was our elaborate, where we did lots of exercising, right? And we related it back to cellular respiration, so on and so forth. Now we're gonna explain what we did. So let's read our aim. Can muscle cells run out of energy? That's a valid question. Can our muscle cells literally run out of energy? And if they do, what's the consequence of that, if any? Now let's read an answer number one. It says, in an experiment to determine the effect of exercise on pulse rate, a student checks his pulse rate before and after exercising for several minutes. The purpose of checking his pulse rate before exercising is that it serves as a control for the experiment. And remember, a control for an experiment just basically means it's going to be used to compare, right? So I'm going to take it before so that way I can compare it to after exercising for several minutes and see if it increased, see if it decreased. I have something to compare it to. Because if I only do it for after exercising, I don't know if it increased or decreased because I don't have a start. I only have a finish. All right. So it's always going to be necessary to have a control of some sort, a control group. Now, number two says, what is an advantage of a change in pulse rate after exercising? And the best answer choice here is, drum roll, please. Number two, an increased blood flow carries excess waste products away from the active muscle cells, right? And what are those waste products that they're talking about? It's going to be mostly CO2, water, which we've spoken about before, and maybe lactic acid as well, right? If it's anaerobic, but it's always going to be CO2 and water, whether it's anaerobic or aerobic respiration. Lactic acid is only manufactured when we run out of oxygen, okay? But two is the best answer choice, all right? So part A, muscle cell input-output model. So if you remember from the Engage video, this is the input-output that they were talking about for that question for number 3. So let's go through it. And we've done an input-output before. We already know what we're talking about. So it's asking for input-output for muscles at rest, and then muscles during exercise. So let's start with input outputs for at rest. By now, we should know that us just sitting here learning about this, we're not actively exercising or doing anything that is high intensity of any sort. So at rest, our muscles pretty much love this, right? Because we have the two essential things that we need. We have oxygen in abundance, right? And we have glucose, right? So especially if you just ate or so, your body can literally digest that food and extract the glucose from it and use it as energy, or your body will literally use up some of the glucose storage systems that you naturally have, which we actually have a lesson on that when we start talking about glucose regulation. But that's another day, right? And then as a result, when we're talking about at rest, what are our outputs? We've gone over this time and time again. As a result of oxygen and glucose being besties and interacting with each other, they have some waste products. And one of those waste products is carbon dioxide, right, which is CO2, water, which is H2O, all right? Those are two outputs. But the whole purpose of respiration is ATP, energy, right? That's the purpose. This is what we want, all right? And this is going to manufacture a lot of ATP for us. Why a lot? Because we have an abundance of oxygen at rest. We're not doing so much work, right? So this literally is going to give us a lot. I'll make like a little line over here. Okay, that's going to give us a lot. And that's what we want. We always want to make sure that we have a lot of ATP so that way we can continue to do work. All right. Now, this is just at rest. And anytime that we think of at rest, I want you guys to think aerobic respiration, right? Oxygen is always going to be present. And again, think aerobic. When I think air, I think oxygen. So just think that way, all right? And the structure that is asking us for, right, whenever oxygen is present, there's only one organelle where we're making all of this energy, and it has to be the powerhouse of the cell. And the powerhouse of the cell is the mitochondria. And I always make sure that I draw it to remind myself of what it looks like, just in case I ever see it in a picture, right? The mitochondria, which is the powerhouse of the cell, that is the structure. Okay, so this is again just at rest, like how we are right now learning about this. Our cells are very, very happy with us. So for this, I can put yippee. This is overall an excellent thing. Now let's slide to muscle cells during exercise. All right, what are our inputs here? All right, our inputs are actually going to be the same. We're gonna have oxygen, except the oxygen that we now have is going to be lower than at rest, right? Because we're using up so much more of it in order to actually exercise, we're gonna have less oxygen present. But while we're not eating, we still have glucose storage centers, so we still have glucose being used. And it's just a habit for me to put the molecular formula, just in case I ever see it written either way. I don't get like nervous or startled that I don't know what it is. I know what these things are, all right? Oh, and by the way, I'm gonna go back up here to where it says at rest. I'm just gonna make the annotation that these are waste products. Carbon dioxide and water are always waste products. ATP is not a waste product, even though it's still an output, right? We don't like to waste energy. If anything, we wanna conserve it. So let's head back down here. So our inputs is oxygen and glucose, or a reduced amount of oxygen and glucose. And our outputs are pretty much the same with one key difference, right? So we have CO2, water. But whenever we have reduced amount of oxygen, or we're using more oxygen than we can actually take in, we start to feel the formation of lactic acid. That's that burning sensation that we actually feel, right? So again, these outputs are waste products. And because we have a reduced amount of oxygen or very little oxygen during exercise, in this case, let's say it's push-ups or sit-ups like we were talking about in the engage, I'm gonna perform, or I'm gonna have a lot of lactic acid buildup, and I want you to think anaerobic. Right? So at rest, we thought aerobic. During exercise, we're gonna think more anaerobic, just like we did with the rubber band one. We didn't have a lot of oxygen getting to those muscles, so it started to make lactic acid. And lactic acid is one way in which our muscles are basically telling us, please give us oxygen. We need oxygen if you want us to continue to work. Now, during anaerobic respiration or during exercise in general, ATP is still being produced. However, is it a lot or little? Very little ATP is being produced, right? Do our muscles like that? No, not at all. However, if I'm constantly training my muscles through exercising, is exercising overall a positive thing? Absolutely, right? So to start, my muscles are not necessarily used to this, but over time, I do expect it to get better, right? Through training, right? Almost like running a marathon. If I don't train to run a marathon like the marathon runner, but I just start doing it, that's not gonna be too great for me, okay? All right, you guys are superstars. So let's move to part B, muscle fatigue text. And it says, read and annotate the important parts of the text below. Let's read together. Why do our muscles get tired when we exercise? Have you ever felt tired during exercise? The more we exercise, the more we are able to do, but even the most fit athletes experience muscle fatigue eventually, all right? Muscles require ATP cellular energy in order to move our body during exercise. We've gone over that before. In the mitochondria of the muscle cells, oxygen is used to harness the chemical energy stored in glucose molecules. This process called aerobic cellular respiration or aerobic respiration and produces a great deal of ATP, which is what we saw here. Aerobic, we saw a lot of ATP at rest. All right, and it generates carbon dioxide and water as waste products. That's basically just literally summing up what we did. And if I wanted to put this in, like, let's say, formula form, right, I would have aerobic respiration as my formula. Whoops, not sure why that happened. All right. And what would I have? I would have oxygen plus glucose is going to give me the waste products of CO2 plus water, but it's going to give me the high energy ATP, right? This is what we want, okay? All right, so as muscle cells work and deplete their oxygen reserves, deplete just means to go down, their oxygen reserves over time, muscle cells are able to continue to generate ATP through a process known as anaerobic cellular respiration inside the cytoplasm of the cell. I forgot to annotate that up here, but because we don't have in our structure oxygen, this type of respiration, anaerobic, doesn't happen at the mitochondria. Mitochondria wants its oxygen or it doesn't want it at all. This is going to happen in the cytoplasm. Okay? Now let's scoot on back down. It does not require oxygen and it produces much less ATP than aerobic respiration. Anaerobic respiration, releases an additional product called lactic acid. This was all put inside of our input-output models. But if we have a formula for aerobic, let's get one for anaerobic respiration. Okay? So even though there's some small amount of oxygen, we're not going to include that here. It's only going to use glucose, which stores a lot of energy for us, but usually that oxygen is used to harness that energy as we annotated earlier. But because it doesn't have that next to it, it's a little lonely. It's not going to give us all the energy that we normally would be able to get from it. So it's still going to produce CO2 and H2O, but lactic acid is also a waste product, and ATP is also produced, but it's very little, right? Versus this one, which is a lot. Now, during exercise, muscle cells may use up most of their glucose stores, which slows down the process of generating ATP. The circulatory and respiratory systems must work faster to clear away the waste products of cellular respiration from muscle cells and to bring in new oxygen and glucose, right? So the respiratory system has the lungs and it's going to take in much more oxygen, but in order for it to do that, we need to get rid of CO2 and water vapor at a much higher rate to bring in more oxygen and to use more glucose to be transported through our blood via the circulatory system. In addition to having more muscle tissue, athletes often have more mitochondria in their muscle cells and more efficient circulatory and respiratory systems in order to meet the demands of extensive exercise, brain fart, right? So if you're an athlete, you're used to maybe track and field, you're used to maybe basketball, or you're used to like running, whatever the case is, swimming. athletes typically have much more efficient circulatory and respiratory inputs and outputs. They're able to use and harness their energy much better than non-athletes, which makes sense, right? Because if they're used to exercising, right, at the start, when they first started, let's say football or track, they were at the, they were here, they were at the start, they were a little sad. But then as they train more and more, they're a lot happier. Their muscles are a lot happier, right? And they also have more mitochondria. More mitochondria literally means more energy, okay? Let's conclude. The glucose required for ATP generation comes from the food that we eat. It may appear that we can never have too much sugar, but excess sugars in the blood cause damage to tissues. Therefore, the body must regulate or balance the amount of sugar that is present in the blood, right? So start thinking about why too much sugar, what that can possibly lead to. And by now, you guys probably know someone that's unable to regulate their blood glucose levels, right? And too much sugar can actually damage tissues. That's why some people that are unable to regulate their glucose levels, sometimes they're amputees. They might have to get like partial leg amputation or a whole leg amputation or some type of limb amputated or so, because it damages the tissues beyond the point of repair. Now the directions say, write your own response to the prompt below. Reference your input-output model, which is above, when talking about your response. How do muscle cells access what they need to keep producing energy? All right, and I want you to explain. And sorry, but I'm not gonna go over this with you. This is where you're going to write independently and just write out your complete thoughts, right? From start to finish. How are we getting what we need in order to keep producing energy, especially during exercise? Because remember, we wanna find out why runner 0358 fell into a coma, all right? And in order to do that, we need to explore many different avenues of things that went right, but also things that could have gone wrong for her. And glucose regulation and respiration are all forms of things that we're definitely interested in, all right? And make sure that you keep a lookout for your medical tent data, which you guys have in the unit opening, that small chart that has 0358 and all of her stats, all right? So you're gonna explain on those lines. I gave you enough lines to explain yourself thoroughly, so no 1 or 2 words. And then after this, there's an interesting exit ticket on blood doping, all right? Which you guys can do on your own. But you know what? I'll read with you, but you guys are gonna write on your own. This needs to get done, but I'll make the deal to read with you, all right? So blood is a fluid tissue, which means that blood cells are suspended in a fluid called plasma. Blood tests are concerned with not only the number of blood cells present, but with the amount of plasma that surrounds the cells, right? That's what makes it fluid. The diagram below represents tubes containing blood samples from an athlete before and after blood doping. Blood doping is an illegal practice reportedly used by some athletes a few weeks before an athletic event and involves removing whole blood from the athlete, separating the oxygen-carrying red blood cells, or RBCs, and then freezing them. These RBCs are then thawed and return to the athlete's body just before the athlete competes, all right? Serious health risks are associated with this practice. Now, the prompt says, explain why athletes who practice blood doping would be expected to perform better at an athletic event. Be specific in your explanation, right? So why would someone that has significantly more red blood cells in their blood sample be able to perform a lot better than someone with the normal amount of red blood cells? All right, remember, you want to talk about glucose here. You want to talk about oxygen here. Why is blood so important in respiration? Why is it so important that blood is traveling through our bodies? What is it carrying to our body cells? What is it taking away from our blood, or from our body cells rather? How is blood being incorporated into respiration, gas exchange, glucose exchange, all of those different things, all right? Make sure that you answer this question. I read it with you. So the deal is that you have to answer this question. and really use your scientific knowledge and any previous lessons that we've spoken about before, any previous videos that we've done before together. Okay? And then after this, you actually have a glucose regulation lab after this, and then we have another explain, then we have an elaborate, and then you have an evaluate, which is your performance task for muscles and energy. So we are skating right through, but you do have another elaborate lab after this one. Okay? You guys are absolutely fantastic, and I will see you for your second explain after your lab after this one. All right? You guys are amazing. See you soon.